so we're diving deep today into the invention of the white race. A lot of you have been asking about this concept, and we found some really fascinating stuff. A lecture by Jeffrey B. Perry, all about the work of these two guys, Theodore W. Allen and Hubert Harrison. They had, well, let's just say some pretty revolutionary ideas about race and class here in America.
Yeah, and it's wild how these two guys, Allen and Harrison, ended up in the same place, with their thinking, even though they came from such different backgrounds. I mean, Allen, he was a coal miner, a union leader, so he had that real working class perspective.
Right.
And Harrison, on the other hand, brilliant guy, self-taught writer. He was known as, the father of Harlem radicalism.
Wow.
He was hugely influential on people like A. Philip Randolph and Marcus Garvey.
Oh, yeah.
Almost like a bridge between these two wings of the civil rights and black liberation movements.
It's amazing how those two totally different paths led to these, powerful shared insights.
Right.
So let's jump into Allen's research, because this is where it gets really interesting. He dove deep into Virginia colonial records. And what he found was kind of shocking. The whole concept of white, like we think of it today, it just wasn't there. Not when the first Africans arrived in 1619. Actually, the word white doesn't even show up in official documents until 1691.
Yeah, and it's not just about the word white missing, What Allen is saying is this whole social category, this white race, as a distinct group, it wasn't functioning the way we see it today. And to illustrate this, he uses the case of this guy, John Punch.
Okay.
Punch was an African, escaped from indentured servitude, along with two European servants.
So they all, you'd think, would get the same punishment.
Right, you'd think so. But the court sentenced Punch to servitude for life.
Wow.
Way harsher than the two European servants. And this happened decades before racial slavery was, formally a thing in Virginia.
So even before formal slavery, you already see race being used to create this hierarchy and to justify treating people differently.
Exactly. It's like a perfect example of how race was already becoming this tool to divide people and reinforce these power structures.
And isn't there this crazy connection? John Punch is actually an ancestor of President Barack Obama.
He is. It really hits you, that history isn't just something in a textbook. It's woven into our lives.
It's mind-blowing. So if there was no white identity yet, back then, how was society structured? What were the big divisions?
Well, you had the class divisions, for sure, the power imbalances. Wealthy landowners, indentured servants, enslaved people. But Allen's point is these lines, they weren't rigidly drawn along racial lines, not yet.
Okay.
A key turning point he talks about is Bacon's Rebellion, 1676.
Oh, yeah.
This multiracial uprising. Poor and working class people all united against the elite.
Interesting.
We're talking European and African indentured servants, poor farmers, all of them, against the wealthy landowners, against the governor.
That's pretty powerful, to see people from different backgrounds coming together like that.
Right, and there's this crazy account from a ship captain who was sent to stop the rebellion. He runs into 400 English and Negroes in arms.
Wow.
They were, he said, much dissatisfied with their conditions.
I bet.
They even debated whether to shoot him or cut him to pieces.
Yikes.
And this solidarity, this coming together, Allen says this is strong evidence that this white race, as we understand it today, it just wasn't a thing.
So if this multiracial solidarity was real, how did we go from that to the rigid racial hierarchy we see later on?
That's where Allen's central idea comes in. He argues the white race, it was intentionally constructed by the ruling class as a way to control people. They saw what happened in Bacon's Rebellion, a united working class that's a threat, so they needed a way to divide and conquer.
Classic tactic, divide and conquer.
Right. So instead of seeing all laborers as a potential problem, they created this system. It elevates European American workers above African Americans. They gave them certain privileges, certain advantages, to get them on their side, to prevent future uprisings.
So those privileges, like a bribe.
Allen calls it poison bait.
Poison bait.
He chose that term very carefully because he's saying these privileges, they seem even at the surface, but they actually hurt both Black Americans and white workers in the long run.
How so?
Well, it stops them from seeing their shared interests, it weakens class solidarity, and ultimately it holds back any real progress towards a fairer society.
So you're saying these privileges, they actually backfire?
They do. And Allen really drives this point home with some powerful slogans. He said, solidarity forever means privileges never. And he compared white privilege to a shot of heroin.
Whoa.
Feels good at first, maybe, but ultimately it destroys you.
Wow, those are strong words and really makes you think differently about those so-called benefits of white privilege when you hear it like that.
It does, doesn't it?
Makes you ask yourself, like, at what cost are we clinging to these supposed benefits? Are we willing to give up solidarity, even justice, for a few crumbs?
It's a big question.
It is. So where does Hubert Harrison fit into all this? He was writing before Allen, right? Like decades earlier.
Yeah. Harrison's work gives us another angle on Allen's argument. He had this really striking metaphor. He said, politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea.
Touchstone. I'm not sure I get that.
So a touchstone, it's this black stone used to test how pure gold is.
Oh.
You rub a piece of metal on it, and if it leaves a golden streak, you know it's real gold.
Okay.
So what Harrison is saying is how a society treats its black citizens. That reveals the true nature of its democracy.
If a society claims to be democratic, but it doesn't uphold the rights, the well-being of its black citizens, then it's not really a democracy.
It's fool's gold.
Got it.
It's such a powerful way to cut through all the talk and see the reality of how committed a society really is. To democratic principles, think about any big issue we face today. Housing, education, healthcare. We can apply Harrison's touchstone. Ask yourself, how are black people doing?
Yeah.
What does that tell us about our society?
That's a really simple but profound idea. It cuts to the core.
It does. And this leads us to another crucial point that both Harrison and W.E.B. Du Bois argued, that enslaved black labor should be understood as proletarian labor. Meaning the same kind of labor as white workers. They were both being exploited by the same system.
That's a very different way to think about it. What changes when we see enslaved black labor through that lens?
Well, it makes the shared interests of black and white workers really clear. It exposes how the white labor movement often betrayed black workers, siding with the ruling class instead of recognizing, their common struggle.
Right.
And it strengthens the argument for class solidarity as the path to liberation.
So we're starting to see this idea of inventing the white race wasn't just about creating racial divisions, it was also about preventing class solidarity, which of course could threaten the whole power structure.
Exactly. So, we were talking about this idea that white workers somehow benefited from white privilege. Allen really pushes back against that.
Yeah, he really does. He doesn't buy the idea that European American workers were complicit in creating white supremacy because they were getting something out of it.
Right, exactly.
So if white workers weren't really benefiting, why go along with it? What was in it for them?
Allen's argument is that they were tricked, manipulated, really, into accepting this whole system. Remember that poison bait idea?
Oh, yeah.
The ruling class, they offered these white workers a few scraps, a slightly better job, maybe, a little more social status, this feeling of being superior, and they convinced them that those tiny privileges, those were worth more than solidarity with their black and brown fellow workers.
So they were blinded by this fake promise of advancement, this idea that they were somehow better than those below them in the racial hierarchy?
Exactly. And Allen points to this historian, Edmund Morgan. He wrote this really influential book, American Slavery, American Freedom.
Okay.
And Morgan says there were very few poor European Americans in Virginia in the 18th century because most of them had moved up out of the working class. Basically, he credits their upward mobility to white privilege.
So Morgan's saying white privilege was the key to their success. But Allen disagrees.
He does. He does into those historical records. And what he found was that this whole idea of widespread upward mobility for European American workers just wasn't true. They weren't moving up out of the working class in huge numbers. They were mostly staying put. The reality is they were being pitted against workers of color. And that feeling of superiority, that was manufactured to stop them from realizing their shared interests, their common struggles.
So it's not that white privilege wasn't real. It's just that its benefits were way overblown. And it was mostly working as this tool to prevent working class unity, a distraction to keep people focused on where they stood in the racial pecking order instead of, how they were all being exploited economically.
Exactly. And this whole strategy, this invention of the white race, it had huge, long-lasting consequences. Allen argues it's one of the main reasons why, in the U.S. there hasn't been a strong sense of class consciousness, why we haven't had a big socialist party or a labor party that could really challenge the ruling class. White supremacy, it got so deeply embedded in American society, it just wrecked any real attempts at working class solidarity.
So it wasn't just about those small, immediate, and often fake benefits for white workers. It was about creating a system to keep them divided, to keep them from seeing their potential power if they were united.
Precisely. And that's why Allen argues that the best way to take down this system is to attack white supremacy directly. We have to expose it for what it is, a tool of social control, benefiting the ruling class at everyone else's expense.
Okay, but that means like such a huge task. Where do we even begin to dismantle something so deeply rooted in our society?
It's a challenge, no doubt, but not impossible. Allen outlines a few key things we can do. First, we got to challenge this idea that white supremacy is like natural or inevitable. We have to help people understand it was created, it was a historical process with specific actors and reasons behind it.
So education is key.
Absolutely.
We have to understand the history of this system if we want to challenge it effectively.
We need to educate ourselves and others about the history of race and class in America, how white privilege has been used to divide and conquer the working class for centuries.
Right. And once we understand that history, then we can start pushing back against the narratives that keep these systems of oppression going.
Right.
We can start to see through those myths and distortions that have been used to justify these inequities.
We need to develop, like, a critical eye, question the information we take in, the stories we tell ourselves, the assumptions we have about race and class.
Unlearning those deep-seated biases, I guess, conscious and unconscious. It's about challenging how we've been taught to think about the world.
Yeah, you got it. It's not easy, but it's totally necessary if we want to create a more just and equal society.
So education is the starting point. What else does Allen suggest as a way to dismantle this system?
He emphasizes building solidarity across racial lines. We have to recognize we have shared interests as working people. We have to come together to challenge the systems that are exploiting us all, oppressing us all.
Easier said than done, though, right? We've seen how effective those poison bait privileges have been at dividing us. How do we overcome those deeply ingrained divisions? How do we build that real solidarity?
It's tough, but not impossible. Allen points to moments in history, where we saw glimpses of that solidarity, like Bacon's Rebellion, where people from different racial backgrounds united to fight for a common cause.
Yeah, there are other examples, too, like the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, even certain times in the labor movement where interracial solidarity was really important.
Right.
Those examples give us hope, don't they? They show us that it is possible.
They do, but we can't just wait around, for those moments to happen on their own. We have to actively cultivate that solidarity, build relationships across racial lines, challenge our own biases, do the hard work, of creating a more just world together.
So it's not just hoping for change. It's actively working to create it in ourselves and in the world around us, having those hard conversations, calling out racism and prejudice when we see it, and working to dismantle these systems that keep the inequities going.
That's it. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that our liberation is tied to each other's liberation. And Allen argues this understanding, it's ultimately in the best interest of white workers, too.
So it's not just about getting rid of racial oppression. It's about getting rid of a system of class exploitation that hurts everyone, regardless of their race. White workers aren't really winning in this system. They're being manipulated into siding with their oppressors.
Exactly. And that's what's so brilliant about Allen's work. He connects those dots, He shows how race and class are intertwined, how they've been used to divide and conquer the working class, and how we can overcome those divisions to create a more just and equal society.
It's been a really eye-opening conversation. I feel like I've got a much better grasp of this whole invention of the white race thing, how it's been used to divide us, and what we can actually do to dismantle it. But it also raises a lot of tough questions.
It does, and that's the power of Allen's work. He didn't just explain things, he challenged us to face the legacy of white supremacy and to work towards a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
And if the white race was invented, like Allen argues so convincingly, can it be uninvented?
It's a big question.
What would it take to undo centuries of racial division, to create a society based on real equality, real solidarity?
Those are the questions we all need to be asking moving forward.
Okay, so we're back, and we're digging deeper into Theodore W. Allen's work on the invention of the white race. In this last part, we're going to see how his theory plays out in actual historical periods. We talked about the Great Depression a bit already. But Allen actually saw three major crises in American history, where this pattern of white privilege being used to divide the working class, to keep the ruling elite in power, really comes through.
Yeah, that's right. Besides the Depression, Allen looked at the Civil War and Reconstruction and the populist revolt back in the 1890s. These periods are super interesting because they really show how racial divisions were intentionally manipulated to mess up a working class solidarity.
Let's start with the Civil War and Reconstruction then. It seems kind of strange, right? That so many poor white Southerners would fight, even die, to protect a system that mostly benefited rich plantation owners. Why would they go against their own economic interests like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it goes right to the core of Allen's argument. He'd say they were fighting to hold on to their racial status, their idea of being superior to black people, even if it meant staying poor.
So that poison bait of white privilege was just that strong.
That's what Allen believed. He thought the ruling class could control white workers by playing on their racial identity, by making them think they were part of this superior group, even if their lives weren't that great materially.
That's kind of tragic, isn't it? How effective that divide and conquer strategy can be. What about after the Civil War, during Reconstruction? Weren't there attempts to build interracial solidarity back then?
There were. Reconstruction was like a brief moment of hope for black and white people to cooperate. You had black and white farmers, sharecroppers, laborers working side by side to rebuild the South, to create a more just society.
It sounds like there was real potential for change. So what happened?
Well, like we've seen throughout history, the ruling class got scared. They saw this growing unity and they felt threatened. So they went back to their old tricks, stirring up racial division. They couldn't let this multiracial coalition get too powerful.
How'd they do it? I mean, how did they undermine these Reconstruction efforts? What specific things did they do?
Violence, intimidation, propaganda, the whole works. They made up and spread these stories about black people being criminals, incompetent. They played on white people's fears of, black domination.
Wow.
And these tactics worked. They drove a wedge between black and white workers who, not long before, had been fighting together for a better life.
It's sad, to see how easily those moments of interracial solidarity can be broken. And by the very people who gained from that division. Allen's third example, the populist revolt of the 1890s, that also seems to show the same pattern, right?
Yeah, it does. The populist movement was this group of poor farmers, black and white, struggling against economic hardship and the growing power of, corporations, banks. They wanted things like railroad regulation, changes to the currency system, policies that would benefit working people, all working people, not just one race.
It sounds like they had a chance to make some real change. What stopped them?
You probably already know the answer. The ruling class. They saw this multiracial coalition as a threat. And what did they do? Played the race card again.
Oof.
They appealed to the prejudices of white farmers, saying they were better off siding with the wealthy white elites than with their black neighbors, who were supposedly trying to take what was rightfully theirs.
It's like this broken record, this pattern that keeps repeating itself over and over throughout history. The people in power find ways to use those existing racial anxieties, those resentments, to keep control, to prevent a truly unified working class from emerging.
Exactly. And Allen's work, it helps us see these patterns, to understand how they've worked in the past, and we can be more alert to spot them and challenge them today.
So these examples, even though they're from the 19th and early 20th centuries, they still feel relevant today.
Oh, they are. Allen was convinced that these historical patterns are still shaping our world. We're still seeing the same tactics being used. Appeals to white fear, resentment, efforts to divide the working class along racial lines.
Can you give us some current examples of how this dynamic is still playing out? How are these historical patterns affecting us today?
Think about how people talk about immigration. All that stuff about immigrants stealing our jobs or threatening our way of life. Those arguments, they're often loaded with coded language. Racial anxieties, they're just echoes of those same divisive tactics used in the past to turn working people against each other.
So it's not just about blatant racism, it's about recognizing these subtler ways that these historical patterns are still working, still shaping how we see the world.
Exactly, and it's about understanding these narratives. They're often created on purpose to benefit the powerful. They're meant to distract us from the real problems, from the systemic inequalities, the economic exploitation that affect all of us.
So what's the solution? How do we break free from these historical patterns? How do we create a more just and equal society?
Allen's work gives us some clues. He says it starts with understanding how these systems came about, how they still work. We have to educate ourselves and others about the history of race and class in America. We need to develop this critical consciousness, to see through the myths, the distortions that keep these systems of oppression going.
So it's not just about learning history. It's about learning to think critically about history.
Exactly. We need to face those uncomfortable truths about our own history, our own part in these systems, and challenge the narratives that have been used to justify these inequalities.
Okay, so education and critical thinking are important. But what about taking action? What can we do, practically, to challenge these patterns that are so ingrained?
We have to actively fight against those narratives that keep white supremacy alive. Call out racism, prejudice whenever we see it, in ourselves and in others. Support organizations, movements that are working to dismantle these systems of oppression. And maybe most importantly, build bridges across racial lines. Create the kind of solidarity that Allen believed was crucial to challenge the power of the ruling class.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but it's the work we need to do if we want to create a more just and equal world.
This has been, well, a really eye-opening journey. I feel like I understand this idea of the invention of the white race so much better now, how it's been used to divide us, and what we can do to try to dismantle it. It raises a lot of tough questions, though.
It does, and that's what makes Allen's work so important. He didn't just give us a theory, he gave us a call to action. He challenged us to face this legacy of white supremacy and work towards a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect.
And if the white race was indeed invented, as Allen argues so powerfully, can it be uninvented? That's a big question, right? What would it take to undo centuries of racial division, to build a society based on real equality, real solidarity?
Those are the questions we all have to ask ourselves if we want to move forward.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We hope you've gained some new insights and that you'll keep engaging with these important, challenging ideas.